Angela Cross, a highly respected and successful black woman in her early 40s, was known throughout her community as both a compassionate healer and a dedicated researcher. She had built her career from the ground up, navigating the challenges of being a black woman in the predominantly white, male-dominated field of medical research. Her work had earned her accolades and awards, but she was most proud of the impact she had on her patients' lives. She had dedicated herself to helping others, driven by a deep sense of purpose and compassion. But her dedication also meant long hours at the hospital, often leaving her physically and mentally drained. It was a crisp autumn evening when Angela finally left the hospital after a grueling 14-hour shift in the intensive care unit. The air outside felt refreshing as she stepped into the cool night, a stark contrast to the sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital corridors she had spent most of her day in. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight of her day, where she'd fought alongside a team of nurses and doctors to keep her patients alive. Her mind was still buzzing with the countless tasks she'd handled, the medications she'd administered, and the lives she'd touched, but she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the prospect of getting home and finally resting. However, as she headed to her car, Angela remembered she needed to pick up some medication for her husband, Marcus. Marcus, a high-ranking official in the government known for his work in civil rights and reform, had recently been dealing with a minor health issue. His doctor had prescribed a new treatment that Angela had promised to pick up from the 24-hour pharmacy on her way home. Even though she was exhausted, Angela knew that Marcus depended on her, and she didn't want to let him down. Their bond was strong, forged over years of mutual respect and understanding, and she took her responsibilities seriously. Angela's car, a reliable but unassuming silver sedan, was parked in the hospital's employee lot. She liked that it didn't draw much attention, allowing her to blend into the background when she wasn't at work. Tonight, however, she felt uneasy as she drove through the quiet streets toward the pharmacy. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a sense of awareness, a habit she had developed from years of being a black woman who knew that people often judged her differently, regardless of her accomplishments or profession. The pharmacy was located in a more upscale part of town, surrounded by chic boutiques and cozy cafes that were now closed for the night. Angela parked her car and stepped out, her white coat flapping lightly in the breeze as she made her way across the nearly empty parking lot. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the pavement, and a few leaves rustled across the ground. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and quickened her pace, hoping to get in and out as quickly as possible. Unbeknownst to Angela, a police cruiser was slowly making its rounds in the area. Officer Ryan Shelby, a white man in his early 40s with a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, was sitting behind the wheel, scanning the quiet streets with a mixture of boredom and simmering irritation. He'd been a police officer for nearly 2 decades, but he was still stuck in middle management, his career stagnating in recent years. Shelby had a reputation within the department, an officer who didn't mince words and often acted on instinct. But those who knew him well understood that his instincts were often clouded by his own biases, fueled by an upbringing in a conservative, racially homogeneous neighborhood, and a deeply embedded resentment for anyone he deemed out of place. Shelby's career frustrations, combined with his personal issues, had only deepened his bitterness. His marriage was on the rocks, his finances were strained, and he often took out his anger on anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of the world. Tonight, his patience was especially thin after a day filled with minor incidents and petty complaints, none of which gave him the sense of importance or authority he craved. He longed for a situation that would allow him to assert his dominance and prove, if only to himself, that he was in control. As Shelby drove past the pharmacy, his gaze landed on Angela, who was walking across the lot, her head slightly bowed as she mentally went over her list of things to do before she could finally sleep. To Shelby, she looked out of place in the upscale neighborhood, even though she was just a woman picking up medication. He noticed her confident stride, the way she held her head high despite the lateness of the hour, and something inside him bristled. It wasn't just that she was black, though that was certainly a part of it. It was her very presence that seemed, in his mind, to challenge his sense of authority over who belonged and who didn't. Shelby narrowed his eyes, his hand hovering over the steering wheel as he considered his options. In his mind, a black woman alone at night in a part of town like this was either involved in something illicit or simply needed to be reminded of her place. Without calling in his location or informing dispatch, Shelby made a split-second decision to confront her. He drove into the lot, his headlights casting an ominous glow over the empty space, and stopped his cruiser just a few yards from Angela's car, blocking her path. Angela felt a chill run down her spine as the police cruiser pulled up. She instinctively straightened her posture, her mind racing as she tried to process the situation. She had encountered law enforcement before, but never like this, never in a way that felt so intrusive, so filled with unspoken threats. She reminded herself to stay calm, to remain composed. She had done nothing wrong, she was simply here to pick up medication. Still, the reality of her situation weighed on her. As a black woman, she knew all too well that sometimes it didn't matter if she was in the right. Officer Shelby stepped out of the car, his expression hard and unyielding. He walked toward Angela with a deliberate, almost predatory stride, his hand resting lightly on his holster. She watched him approach, feeling her heart begin to pound. When he finally stopped a few feet away, he stared at her with a cold, assessing look that sent a wave of unease through her. "Good evening," Officer Angela said, her voice calm but firm. "Is there something I can help you with?" Shelby ignored her greeting, his eyes narrowing as he looked her up and down, taking in her white coat and the subtle but unmistakable badge clipped to her shirt pocket that identified her as hospital staff. To most people, the coat and badge would have immediately indicated who she was and why she was there, but Shelby seemed unimpressed, as if he had already decided that none of that mattered. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. "This isn't exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find someone like you." Angela felt a surge of irritation but kept her face neutral. She had learned long ago that reacting too quickly or too emotionally could escalate situations like this. She calmly explained that she was a doctor at the nearby hospital, here to pick up medication. She spoke clearly, making sure her words were precise, but Shelby's expression remained suspicious. He leaned closer, his posture stiffening as he scrutinized her every move. "Is that so?" he sneered. "Well, I think I'll be the judge of that. Let me see some ID." Angela took a steadying breath, reaching slowly into her coat pocket. She handed him her hospital ID, her gaze steady as she met his eyes. Shelby looked at the card, barely glancing at the name before his lip curled in disdain. "A doctor," he sounded almost mocking, as if the very idea of her in such a position was laughable. "Fancy title doesn't mean much here. I'll need to check your car. Open it up." Angela's patience was wearing thin, but she knew better than to argue. She took out her keys and unlocked the car, stepping aside as Shelby began to rifle through her belongings. She stood there, her face impassive, but inside she felt a mixture of anger and helplessness rising. As Shelby continued his search, he noticed a small velvet box in her glove compartment, a gift she'd been meaning to give to her husband. Without a second thought, he opened it and found a gold ring. He held it up, a smirk crossing his face. "Nice jewelry," he commented, his tone dripping with condescension. "Something tells me this isn't exactly in your budget. Care to explain where you got it?" Angela's composure faltered for a brief moment. The ring was indeed expensive, a token of love she had carefully saved for to surprise Marcus. But the insinuation that she could not afford it struck a nerve. She took a deep breath, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I bought it with my own money, officer. Now, if you're finished, I'd like to leave." Shelby looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name: contempt, perhaps, or something darker. For a brief moment, she thought he might let her go. But then his grip tightened on the box, and his gaze hardened. "Not so fast," he said, his voice low. Angela felt her patience wearing thin as she watched Officer Shelby scrutinize the small velvet box with her husband's ring. It wasn't just his words that cut deeply, it was the way he held himself, exuding authority and power with a smugness that suggested he had already judged and convicted her in his mind. She felt an unsettling mix of indignation and vulnerability. Despite her composed exterior, a small part of her wanted to lash out, to tell him exactly what she thought of this pointless, humiliating search. But years of experience had taught her to remain calm. Emotions were often a weapon others could use against her, and she was determined not to give him that satisfaction. Shelby, meanwhile, reveled in her silence, mistaking her restraint for submission. He was accustomed to seeing people shrink under his gaze, and it fed his sense of control. He placed the ring back into the glove compartment with deliberate slowness, as if asserting his dominance over her space. For a fleeting moment, he almost seemed disappointed that she hadn't reacted more visibly. He wanted a reaction, anything to justify his treatment of her, to confirm his deeply ingrained belief that people like Angela were always hiding something, always a threat beneath their carefully maintained composure. As he slammed the glove compartment shut, Angela winced, but she stayed still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She met his eyes, trying to convey a silent message of defiance without uttering a word. Shelby picked up on it, but instead of backing down, he leaned into the tension, his tone becoming colder and more condescending. "You don't seem to be taking this very seriously," he sneered, crossing his arms and positioning himself in a way that blocked her path back to her car. "Aren't you a bit too comfortable here for someone who's, just picking up some medication in the middle of the night?" Angela took a deep breath, measuring her response. "Officer, I've answered all of your questions. I'm here for my husband's medication. I am a doctor, I have a full day behind me, and I simply want to go home. I don't see a reason for this continued interrogation." Shelby's eyes narrowed, as if he'd been personally insulted by her calm, measured tone. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Angela could smell the faint whiff of cologne and stale coffee on him, and it made her stomach turn. "Oh, I see how it is," he said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "You think you're above all this because you've got a fancy job title, because you're wearing a white coat. That doesn't mean a thing to me. Out here, you're no different from anyone else." Angela's chest tightened as he spoke, each word dripping with thinly veiled contempt. She sensed that he was goading her, trying to push her past her limits, waiting for her to make even the smallest misstep. It was a trap, and she knew it. But she couldn't stay silent forever. This was her life, her dignity he was trampling on, and she felt a surge of anger that was difficult to contain. "Officer Shelby, I don't see what I've done to warrant this treatment," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse was racing. "I've cooperated fully, shown you my ID, and explained my presence here. If there's no valid reason for you to continue detaining me, I'd like to leave." Her words seemed to hit a nerve, and Shelby's face twisted with irritation. He hated when people tried to turn his authority against him, especially people he felt had no right to question him. Angela's tone, professional, polite, yet laced with an unmistakable firmness, challenged his sense of control. and he was not about to let her walk away feeling as though she had the upper hand. "Oh, you'd like to leave, would you?" he replied with a smirk. "I'm sure you would, but I think there's more to this situation than you're letting on. And I have every right to make sure nothing suspicious is going on here." With that, he stepped around her and moved toward the trunk of her car, gesturing for her to open it. Angela's patience finally cracked. She had given him everything he asked for, yet he continued to dig deeper, refusing to let her go. Go. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, and she felt the frustration boiling over. "Officer, I don't see why you would need to check my trunk," she said, her voice firmer now, almost challenging. "This is harassment. I've done nothing wrong, and I think you're well aware of that." For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Shelby's face, as if he hadn't expected her to speak up so boldly. But just as quickly, his expression hardened, and he reached for his radio. Angela's stomach twisted as he brought the radio up to his mouth, a calculated move designed to intimidate her, to remind her who held the authority. "Dispatch. This is Officer Shelby," he said into the radio, his voice cold and clipped. "I have a potential suspect refusing cooperation here. Need backup at my location." Angela's eyes widened in disbelief. "Potential suspect," she echoed, the shock evident in her voice. "Are you serious? I've done nothing." "Ma'am, I suggest you stop talking," Shelby interrupted, his tone sharp and dismissive. "You're only making things worse for yourself." Angela's mind raced. This was escalating faster than she had anticipated, spiraling beyond her control. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat a reminder of how quickly her life had veered into a nightmare. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she knew that anything she said would only serve to strengthen Shelby's resolve. As they waited in tense silence, a few scattered cars passed by on the street, their headlights briefly illuminating the unsettling tableau of Shelby standing rigidly beside Angela's car, his posture exuding authority and control, while Angela stood with her arms crossed defensively, her expression one of barely concealed outrage. Minutes later, another patrol car pulled into the lot, its flashing lights casting a red and blue glow across the empty parking spaces. A second officer, a younger man with a wary expression, stepped out of the vehicle and approached them. He gave Shelby a questioning look, clearly unsure of the reason for the call. "What's going on here?" Officer Shelby, the younger officer, asked, his gaze shifting between Shelby and Angela. His tone was calm, almost cautious, as if he sensed the tension in the air. "Caught her loitering," Shelby replied tersely, his gaze fixed on Angela. "She claims she's here to pick up medication, but I'm not buying it. I think there's more to this than she's saying." The younger officer, whom Angela could see had Thompson on his badge, glanced at her with a slight frown. She sensed a flicker of doubt in his eyes, as if he were questioning the validity of Shelby's accusations. But he said nothing, likely wary of challenging his senior in front of a civilian. Angela took a deep breath, seeing a sliver of hope in Officer Thompson's uncertainty. She addressed him directly, choosing her words carefully. "Officer Thompson, I'm a doctor. I just finished a long shift at the hospital, and I'm here to pick up medication for my husband. I've cooperated fully, but Officer Shelby here seems determined to treat me like a criminal for no reason." Thompson looked back at Shelby, his brow furrowing slightly. "She has an ID. Did you verify her credentials?" Shelby's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with irritation of being questioned. "She's got a hospital ID, sure," he muttered. "But that doesn't prove anything. People can get fake IDs anywhere these days. You can't be too careful." Angela's patience was nearly gone. She knew she was treading a fine line, but she couldn't stand by while her integrity was continually called into question. She turned to Thompson, her voice calm but firm. I don't know what more I can do to convince you that I'm just here to pick up medication. This is my car, these are my belongings, and I've answered every question asked of me. Thompson seemed to hesitate, glancing at Shelby once more. Angela saw a flash of discomfort in his eyes, as if he were weighing his loyalty to his colleague against his instinct that something was wrong here. But ultimately, the silent pressure from Shelby seemed to sway him. We'd better do a full check to make sure, he said reluctantly, casting a brief, almost apologetic look at Angela. Shelby's smirk returned, his confidence restored. Exactly what I thought, he said, signaling for Angela to step back as he prepared to search the trunk. Angela stepped back, her frustration barely contained as she watched Officer Shelby approach the trunk of her car with the air of someone who'd already won. She could feel the weight of both officers' gazes on her, their authority looming over her in the dimly lit parking lot. The night air was cool, but a thin layer of sweat formed on her palms. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she kept her face neutral, refusing to show them any trace of fear or anger. This wasn't the first time she had been unfairly judged, but it was certainly the most blatant and invasive instance of it. Shelby gestured to her trunk with a mocking nod, silently commanding her to open it. Angela hesitated, weighing her options, but she knew that any resistance would only worsen the situation. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her keys, unlocking the trunk with a quiet click. The lid lifted, revealing the contents of her neatly organized trunk: a medical bag containing emergency supplies she kept for her family, a spare pair of running shoes, and a few reusable grocery bags folded in one corner. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing even remotely suspicious. But Shelby's eyes narrowed as he surveyed her belongings, a scowl crossing his face as if he were determined to find something incriminating. He rummaged through the items with a harshness that felt invasive, tossing her belongings around carelessly, and Angela's patience wore thinner with each second. She bit her tongue, reminding herself that reacting emotionally would only feed his ego. This was a game to him, a display of power, and she was determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. As Shelby dug deeper, his movements grew more agitated, his frustration becoming evident. He pulled out her medical bag, unzipped it, and began examining its contents: stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, antiseptics, and other tools of her profession. He held up a small container of antiseptic wipes, turning it over as if it were some exotic contraband. "What's all this?" he sneered, shaking the medical bag in front of her. Angela's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "It's my emergency medical kit. I'm a doctor, as I've explained to you multiple times. That's standard equipment for my line of work." Shelby scoffed, tossing the bag carelessly back into the trunk. "A doctor, huh? So you say. You know, I've seen plenty of people use that excuse. Doesn't mean I'm going to take your word for it." Angela felt a surge of indignation rise within her, but she forced herself to remain composed. She wasn't about to let him push her over the edge. She took a steadying breath, looking him directly in the eyes. "I've cooperated with every request you've made, Officer Shelby. I've shown you my ID, answered your questions, and allowed you to search my vehicle without cause. Now, unless you have a legitimate reason to continue detaining me, I would like to leave." Shelby's face darkened, his expression twisting into a sneer. He wasn't used to people, especially people like Angela, speaking to him with such calm assertiveness. He stepped closer, towering over her with an air of barely restrained hostility. "You think you can just tell me how to do my job?" he snapped, his voice low and menacing. "Let me make one thing clear: I decide when this search is over, not you." Angela's resolve wavered for a split second as his words sank in. She could feel the power imbalance pressing down on her. the sense of helplessness that came with being at the mercy of someone who viewed her as less than human. But she held her ground, refusing to let him intimidate her. She had done nothing wrong, and she wasn't about to let him strip away her dignity. Shelby, however, wasn't finished. He turned to Officer Thompson, who had been standing by, watching the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and reluctance. Shelby jerked his head toward Angela's car, his voice curt. "Keep an eye on her. I'm calling in for additional support. I think we might have a case here." Thompson hesitated, casting a quick glance at Angela before looking back at Shelby. "A case? For what? She hasn't done anything, Ryan. Maybe it's better if we just let her go." Shelby shot him a cold, warning look, his jaw tightening. "Do you want to question my judgment, Thompson? Because if you're not interested in doing your job, I'm sure I can find someone else who is." Thompson swallowed, visibly uncomfortable, but he nodded reluctantly. "Understood," he muttered, stepping closer to Angela while Shelby moved off to make his call. Angela could see the conflict in Thompson's eyes, a flicker of doubt that suggested he didn't fully believe in Shelby's actions. She wanted to appeal to his sense of decency, to convince him to let her go, but she knew that he was trapped in the same system as she was, bound by loyalty and hierarchy. Shelby's voice drifted over to them as he spoke into his radio, requesting backup and making veiled accusations that cast Angela in a suspicious light. She could hear phrases like uncooperative and potential suspect, words that twisted the reality of the situation into something far more sinister. Her chest tightened as she listened, her frustration giving way to a sense of dread. She knew how easily narratives could be manipulated, how quickly a person's life could be turned upside down by a few words spoken by someone in power. As Shelby finished his call, he turned back to Angela, his eyes glinting with a cold satisfaction. "Looks like you'll be here a little while longer," he said with a smirk. "Hope you don't have anywhere important to be." Angela's fists clenched at her sides, and she forced herself to take a deep breath. She had to remain calm, even as the situation continued to spiral out of control. She had been on her feet for hours, her body exhausted from the day's work, and now she was being treated like a criminal for no reason other than existing in a space Shelby deemed off limits to her. The injustice of it all burned within her, but she knew that any display of anger would only give him more ammunition. A few tense minutes passed, the silence punctuated by the low hum of nearby traffic and the occasional crackle of static from Shelby's radio. Angela could feel Thompson's gaze on her, his expression unreadable, and she wondered if he was wrestling with the morality of what was happening. Part of her wanted to confront him, to ask him if he truly believed she was a threat, but she held back, unwilling to provoke any further escalation. Finally, another patrol car pulled into the parking lot, and two additional officers stepped out, their faces shadowed by the streetlights. They exchanged brief glances with Shelby, who nodded in Angela's direction, filling them in on his version of events with a few quick, dismissive sentences. Angela felt her heart sink as the two officers approached her, their postures tense and unyielding. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from the vehicle," one of them said, his voice devoid of warmth. Angela looked between them, her mind racing as she tried to assess her options. She had already complied with every demand, answered every question, and yet they continued to treat her as though she were dangerous, as though her very presence were an affront. She knew that refusing their instructions would only worsen her predicament, but the sheer injustice of it all weighed on her like a heavy stone. Taking a deep breath, she stepped back from the car, her gaze steady as she met each officer's eyes in turn. She wanted them to see her, to recognize her humanity, but all she saw reflected back was cold professionalism, a wall of indifference that refused to acknowledge her as anything more than a suspect. Shelby stepped forward, his expression smug as he addressed the other officers. "Search the vehicle thoroughly. I'm sure there's something she's hiding." Angela's composure finally cracked. She couldn't stand by any longer, couldn't watch as they continued to violate her space, her rights. "This is harassment," she said, her voice louder and more forceful than before. "You have no reason to keep me here. I've done nothing wrong and you know it." Shelby's smirk widened, and he took a step closer, his gaze hard and unrelenting. "Ma'am, I suggest you lower your voice," he said, his tone laced with a thinly veiled threat. "Getting angry isn't going to help your situation." Angela's pulse quickened as she realized how thoroughly he had trapped her. If she stayed silent, he would continue his invasive search, convinced of her guilt. But if she spoke out, he would use her anger as justification for further escalation. It was a lose-lose scenario, a carefully orchestrated web of intimidation designed to strip away her dignity and leave her powerless. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm, even as her body trembled with exhaustion and frustration. She had to find a way out of this, a way to break free from the relentless scrutiny and regain control of her life. But as she looked around, surrounded by officers who seemed more intent on asserting their authority than on seeking the truth, she felt the walls closing in, her options dwindling with each passing second. One of the other officers glanced at Shelby, his brow furrowed. "Ryan, maybe we should ease off. She's given us everything we've asked for. Don't think there's much else here." Shelby shot him a withering look. "You want to let her walk away after all this? She's hiding something. I can feel it. I'm not about to let some entitled doctor think she's above the law." Angela's eyes narrowed as she listened to his words, the blatant disregard for her humanity. She realized in that moment that Shelby wasn't just trying to humiliate her, he was trying to break her, to force her into submission as a means of asserting his own power. The realization sent a surge of resolve through her, a renewed determination to stand her ground, no matter how dire the situation. But before she could respond, Shelby reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. Angela's heart skipped a beat, her body tensing as his fingers dug into her skin, and for the first time, a flicker of fear pierced her resolve. Angela winced as Officer Shelby's hand tightened around her arm, his fingers digging into her skin with an intensity that left no room for misunderstanding. He wasn't just trying to detain her, he was asserting his dominance, forcing her into a position where any movement, any reaction, could be twisted into evidence of resistance. She tried to pull her arm back instinctively, but his grip was relentless, locking her in place. "Let go of me," she said firmly, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, though she felt her pulse pounding in her ears. Every instinct told her to stay calm, to avoid escalating the situation, but the reality of being physically restrained, of her autonomy stripped away, filled her with a simmering rage she struggled to suppress. Shelby's smirk deepened as he sensed her discomfort, his gaze narrowing with satisfaction. "Ma'am, I suggest you don't make this harder on yourself," he said, his voice low and threatening. Resisting an officer is a serious offense. One wrong move, and you'll end up facing charges you won't be able to talk your way out of. Angela's mind raced as she processed his words. The absurdity of it all was almost surreal. She was a doctor, a professional, a woman simply trying to make it home after a long day, and yet here she was, being threatened with arrest by a man who seemed to take pleasure in twisting the narrative to suit his ego. It was like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from, each moment dragging her deeper into a web of control and intimidation. One of the other officers, Thompson, shifted uneasily nearby, his face a mixture of hesitation and uncertainty. Angela caught his eye, hoping for some glimmer of empathy, some sign that he recognized the injustice unfolding before him. But Thompson looked away, his loyalty to Shelby outweighing whatever doubts he might have harbored. She realized then that there would be no help coming from within their ranks. She was truly on her own. A few seconds later, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot, its sleek frame contrasting sharply with the harsh fluorescent lights illuminating the lot. Angela's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the vehicle. It was Marcus's car. He must have been nearby and decided to swing by to pick up the medication himself, she thought. Relief washed over her momentarily, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of anxiety. The last thing she wanted was for Marcus to witness this, to see her treated like a criminal. She knew how fiercely protective he was, and she feared that his intervention could escalate the situation even further. Marcus stepped out of the SUV, his face shadowed but his posture unmistakably tense. He was a tall, imposing man with a calm but commanding presence, a presence that had served him well in his career as a high-ranking government official and civil rights advocate. He had spent years fighting for justice, advocating for marginalized communities, and holding law enforcement accountable. And now, as he took in the scene before him, a mixture of anger and disbelief flickered across his face. Angela, his voice was laced with concern as he took a step forward, his gaze shifting from his wife to Shelby's hand gripping her arm. "What's going on here?" Shelby's smirk faltered slightly as he noticed Marcus, sensing the authority in the man's voice and posture. But he quickly recovered, tightening his grip on Angela's arm as if to assert control. "Sir, I'd advise you to stay back. This is a police matter." Marcus ignored him, his attention focused solely on Angela. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone gentle but edged with tension. Angela nodded. Though she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the reality of how easily this could spiral further out of control. "Marcus, it's fine," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "They're doing a search." Marcus's jaw tightened as he registered the strain in her voice. He turned his gaze to Shelby, his expression hardening. "I'm going to ask you to release my wife," he said calmly but firmly. "She's a doctor, and there's no reason for this treatment." Shelby's eyes flashed with irritation, and he released Angela's arm with a dismissive scoff. "Sir, your wife was acting suspiciously, and I have every right to question her. If you interfere, you'll be obstructing an investigation." Marcus's face remained impassive, but Angela could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. She knew him well enough to recognize the signs. His jaw clenched, his shoulders squared, his eyes narrowed in barely contained fury. But he kept his tone measured, refusing to give Shelby any ammunition to use against him. "Investigation," Marcus repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "What exactly are you investigating? My wife is a respected physician, and she's here for a prescription, not a crime scene. I think it's time for you to back down." Shelby took a step forward, his posture rigid with defiance. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but you're interfering with official police business. I suggest you take a step back before you make things worse." Marcus's eyes locked onto Shelby's, his voice lowering to a tone that was both calm and commanding. "I know exactly who I am, Officer Shelby, and I know my rights and my wife's rights. You are overstepping your authority, and I have no intention of allowing this to continue." For a moment, an uneasy silence hung in the air, the tension between the two men almost palpable. Angela could feel the weight of Marcus's presence beside her, a source of strength and stability that contrasted sharply with Shelby's antagonistic posture. She knew that Marcus was a man of principles, a man who had fought his whole life for justice, and she felt a surge of gratitude and pride for his unwavering support. But Shelby's pride wouldn't let him back down. His face twisted into a sneer, and he gestured toward the other officers. "You think you're some big shot, huh?" he taunted. "Well, out here you're just another civilian. and right now you're interfering with a lawful investigation." Marcus's calm demeanor remained unshaken, but Angela could see the flicker of frustration in his eyes. She knew how much it cost him to keep his composure in the face of such blatant disrespect, but he maintained his control, refusing to let Shelby provoke him. "Let me be clear," Officer Shelby Marcus said, his voice steely. "I have a full understanding of what is lawful and what isn't, and what you're doing here is far from it. If you continue to harass my wife without any legitimate cause, there will be consequences." Shelby's eyes narrowed, his smirk faltering as he realized that Marcus wasn't backing down. But rather than conceding, he doubled down, his face twisting into a mask of arrogance and defiance. "Is that a threat?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Because I'd be careful if I were you. Threatening a police officer can get you in serious trouble." Before Marcus could respond, Thompson, the younger officer, cleared his throat, stepping forward with an expression of unease. "Ryan, maybe we should just let them go. We've checked everything and there's nothing here. It's getting late and I think they've had enough." Shelby shot him a venomous glare, clearly infuriated by the perceived insubordination. "What's the matter with you, Thompson? You're going soft? This isn't about enough, this is about doing our job." Thompson hesitated, glancing at Marcus and Angela, his face conflicted. He knew that continuing the confrontation served no purpose, and he could sense the potential repercussions if they kept pushing. But he was torn between his loyalty to Shelby and his own sense of fairness. Angela saw the hesitation in Thompson's eyes and decided to seize the moment. "Officer Thompson, you know this isn't right. I've complied with every request. My husband is here now. We just want to go home." Thompson's face softened, and he glanced at Shelby, who was fuming but momentarily silent. Angela felt a glimmer of hope, perhaps. Finally, someone would recognize the injustice in this situation and put an end to it. But Shelby's pride wouldn't let him retreat so easily. He turned to Marcus with a sneer. "Fine," he spat. "Take your wife and go. But remember this, you may think you're above the law, but I'll be watching. Next time, you won't be so lucky." Marcus gave him a cold, level gaze, not dignifying the threat with a response. Instead, he took Angela's hand, guiding her gently back toward the SUV. She could feel the tension still coiled within him, but his grip was reassuring, steadying her as they put distance between themselves and the officers. As they got into the car, Angela let out a shaky breath, the weight of the encounter settling over her. She had held herself together through sheer willpower, but now, in the safety of the car, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The humiliation, the fear, the anger, all of it washed over her, leaving her feeling both vulnerable and enraged. Marcus reached over, taking her hand in his gaze filled with both sorrow and determination. "I'm so sorry, Angela," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "This should never have happened. I promise you I won't let this go." Angela nodded, swallowing hard as she squeezed his hand. She knew that Marcus meant every word, that he would do everything in his power to hold Shelby accountable. But deep down, she also knew that this was more than just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that wouldn't be solved easily or quickly. As they drove away from the pharmacy, the events of the night replayed in her mind, each memory a painful reminder of the reality they faced. She knew that Marcus would fight for her, that he would stand by her no matter what. But the scars of the experience, the helplessness, the indignity would stay with her, a reminder of the battles that lay ahead. As the days passed after the incident, Marcus kept his word. He couldn't shake the image of Angela standing in that parking lot, vulnerable yet defiant, subjected to the whims of a power-hungry officer who seemed to take pleasure in intimidating her. The encounter left him both deeply troubled and fiercely resolute. He had spent years working within the government, advocating for justice and equality, but this incident felt personal intimately, painfully so. It was no longer a matter of policy or reform, it was about his family, his wife, and the fundamental right she had to live without fear. Angela was quieter than usual in the days following the encounter, her once steady composure replaced by a heaviness that Marcus hadn't seen before. Though she tried to resume her daily routine, there was a lingering sadness in her eyes, a shadow that seemed to follow her every movement. She had always been strong, resilient, but this experience had left her shaken in a way that Marcus couldn't ignore. Each night, he held her close, whispering reassurances, but he could sense the toll it was taking on her. He knew that his promise to seek justice wasn't just a vow, it was a necessity. Angela needed to see that someone was willing to fight for her, to stand up against the forces that had attempted to diminish her worth. Marcus began his quest by gathering evidence. As a government official, he was aware of the formal channels, the ways to file complaints and initiate investigations. But he also knew that cases like this, cases involving police misconduct, especially where racial prejudice played a role, were often met with resistance and bureaucracy. The system was not designed to hold its own accountable, and he suspected that Shelby, with his years on the force, knew how to manipulate it to his advantage. To avoid alerting Shelby or his superiors too early, Marcus contacted a close friend, Charles Moreno, a former police officer who had left the force to become a private investigator. Charles was a seasoned investigator, someone who understood the inner workings of law enforcement and was willing to push back against corruption. He also had a personal reason to help. He had left the police force after witnessing and being unable to change the entrenched biases that protected officers like Shelby. Together, they formed a plan to gather as much indisputable evidence as possible before officially filing a complaint. Charles began by conducting a background check on Shelby, looking for any history of complaints or misconduct. What he found didn't surprise Marcus but painted a disturbing picture. There were multiple complaints against Shelby for excessive force, racial profiling, and even harassment, yet none of these had led to significant disciplinary action. Each case had been brushed under the rug, either dismissed as unfounded or quietly settled before reaching the public eye. Marcus could see the pattern, a pattern of a man who believed himself untouchable, protected by the very institution he served. Marcus and Charles decided they needed more concrete evidence, something irrefutable that would hold up under scrutiny. Charles suggested they try to find witnesses, anyone who might have been present that night or who could testify to Shelby's past behavior. Marcus agreed and began reaching out to local businesses near the pharmacy, hoping that one of them might have security footage or a record of what happened that night. It was a tedious and often frustrating process, with many business owners unwilling to get involved, fearing backlash or simply preferring to avoid confrontation with the police. However, after days of searching, Marcus finally caught a break. The manager of a nearby coffee shop agreed to meet with him. In the quiet back room of the coffee shop, the manager hesitantly handed over a USB drive with footage from one of the outdoor cameras, which had captured part of the interaction between Angela and Shelby. Though the footage didn't show every detail, it clearly showed Shelby grabbing Angela's arm and speaking to her in an aggressive manner. It was a small victory, but a significant one. As Marcus and Charles reviewed the footage, a new idea began to take shape. They realized that one piece of footage wasn't enough. They needed to create a narrative, a series of testimonies and evidence that would highlight not only what Shelby had done to Angela, but also his history of similar behavior. They needed to show that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of abuse. This would be their strongest weapon against Shelby and any attempts to protect him. They tracked down a former neighbor of Shelby's, a middle-aged black man named Samuel, who had a history with the officer. Samuel reluctantly agreed to talk, his voice filled with bitterness as he recounted a night years ago when Shelby had harassed him outside his own home, questioning him for loitering in his own driveway. Samuel had filed a complaint, but it had gone nowhere, lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy. Hearing his story, Marcus felt a surge of anger. It was a painfully familiar scenario, the same abuse of authority that Angela had faced. Over the next few days, Charles uncovered more individuals with similar stories. Some were hesitant to speak, fearing retaliation, but Marcus reassured them that they would be protected. Gradually, they built a dossier of evidence, each story reinforcing the image of a man who used his badge as a weapon, a shield to protect his own insecurities and prejudices. Finally, Marcus decided it was time to take the next step. He contacted a prominent civil rights attorney, Liana Hayes, known for her fearless advocacy and success in cases against police misconduct. Liana agreed to represent Angela, and together they filed a formal complaint with the police department, backed by the evidence Marcus and Charles had gathered. The complaint was detailed and damning, outlining not only the incident with Angela but also Shelby's history of misconduct. The filing of the complaint sent shockwaves through the department. Shelby was furious, and within hours, he was on the phone with his superiors, demanding answers, trying to downplay the allegations and accusing Marcus of a witch hunt. But Marcus had anticipated this response. Liana had advised him to prepare for Shelby's retaliation, to expect the officer to do everything in his power to discredit Angela and Marcus. They were ready for whatever Shelby might throw at them. Within days, Shelby began his counterattack. He reached out to his contacts in the department and attempted to gather information on Marcus and Angela, hoping to dig up anything that could tarnish their reputations. He hinted to his colleagues that Marcus was using his influence to target him unjustly, trying to frame himself as the victim in the situation. To anyone who would listen, Shelby painted a picture of a powerful man using his resources to destroy an honest cop. But Marcus and Liana anticipated this tactic, and they remained vigilant, preparing for every smear Shelby attempted. They countered his narrative by releasing statements that emphasized Angela's career, her reputation, and the unjust treatment she had faced. Marcus didn't shy away from his role in government, instead highlighting it as a reason for his commitment to justice. Public opinion began to shift, and the community rallied behind them. People were tired of seeing abuses swept under the rug, and Angela's story struck a chord. Shelby grew more desperate, his attempts to control the situation slipping through his fingers. The police department, under intense public pressure, announced that they would conduct an internal investigation, though Marcus and Liana knew that this was often a mere formality. They continued to build their case, gathering every scrap of evidence, every testimony, preparing for the possibility that they might need to take this fight to the public arena. One night, as Marcus was reviewing documents in his study, he received an unexpected call from an anonymous number. Hesitantly, he answered, and the voice on the other end identified itself as a fellow officer within Shelby's department, someone who wished to remain unnamed but had information about Shelby's connections within the force. The caller revealed that Shelby had long-standing alliances with certain higher-ups who had shielded him from repercussions for years. They warned Marcus to be careful, as these individuals were powerful and would do whatever it took to protect their own. The warning only fueled Marcus's determination. He knew that taking on Shelby was no longer just about Angela, it was about challenging an entire system that enabled and protected officers like him. He also knew that he was stepping into dangerous territory, that his family could be at risk. But he refused to back down. As tensions mounted, Marcus took additional precautions, arranging private security for Angela and their family, ensuring that they wouldn't be caught off guard by any of Shelby's retaliatory moves. He shared the warning with Charles and Liana, who both agreed that they needed to proceed with caution but also with purpose. They couldn't allow fear to dictate their actions. In a final, desperate move, Shelby attempted to confront Marcus directly. One evening, as Marcus was leaving his office, he found Shelby waiting for him outside, his face twisted with anger and desperation. "You think you can ruin my life," Shelby snarled, stepping closer, his voice low and venomous. "You think you're untouchable? People like you. You don't know what it means to be out there, to do what I do every day." Marcus remained calm, his voice steady as he replied, "People like me. Officer Shelby, people like me have spent our lives fighting for fairness and justice. What you did to my wife and what you've done to others isn't justice, it's abuse. And it ends here." Shelby's expression darkened, his fists clenched as he struggled to contain his fury. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he spat. "I've been doing this job for years. I've dealt with people like you before, and I'm still here." Marcus held his ground, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, you're still here, but not for much longer. The people who cover for you, they can't protect you from the truth." Shelby glared at him, a mixture of hatred and fear flickering in his eyes. For the first time, Marcus saw the cracks in his armor, the fear beneath the bravado. Shelby was a man who had relied on the protection of others for so long that he didn't know how to stand on his own. Marcus recognized that fear, that desperate clinging to power, a power that was now slipping away. With a final defiant glare, Shelby turned and walked away, his shoulders tense, his steps heavy. Marcus watched him go, feeling both relief and a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation had cemented his resolve. He knew that this fight was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Back home, Angela sat beside Marcus, her hand resting gently on his. She listened as he recounted the confrontation with Shelby, a mixture of pride and gratitude shining in her eyes. Though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. They would face whatever challenges came their way, together, fortified by their love and commitment to justice. As they sat in the quiet comfort of their home, Marcus knew that they were about to take their battle to the next level. The internal investigation was just the beginning. Soon they would expose Shelby and the system that enabled him for everyone to see. The day of the formal hearing arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Marcus and Angela sat side by side in the hearing room, their hands intertwined, a silent reassurance of their shared strength and resolve. Liana Hayes, their attorney, sat beside them, her posture confident and focused. Across the room, Officer Ryan Shelby sat flanked by his own legal team, his expression hard, his gaze cold as he avoided meeting Angela's eyes. The hearing room was filled with a quiet anticipation. Representatives from the police department, along with internal affairs officials, sat at the front, prepared to examine the evidence against Shelby. The case had drawn considerable attention in the past few weeks, with community leaders, activists, and even some local politicians publicly demanding accountability. The stakes were high, and both sides knew it. As the proceedings began, Liana rose to deliver her opening statement. Her voice was steady, calm, and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of Angela's ordeal and the broader implications of the case. "This is not just about one isolated incident," she began, addressing the panel. "This is about a pattern of abuse, a misuse of authority, and a failure of accountability within our law enforcement system. Officer Shelby's actions on the night of the incident were not only a violation of Angela Cross's rights, but also a reflection of a deeper, systemic issue, an issue that must be addressed if we are to restore trust in our institutions." Liana laid out the details of the case with precision, highlighting not only the harassment and physical aggression Angela endured but also the disturbing history of complaints against Shelby. She presented the evidence Marcus and Charles had meticulously gathered testimonies from other victims, video footage showing Shelby's excessive force, and documented complaints that had been dismissed or quietly buried. The dossier painted a damning picture, revealing Shelby as a man who had abused his badge time and time again, shielded by a system that failed to hold him accountable. As Liana spoke, Marcus stole a glance at Shelby. He could see the officer's jaw tighten, his fists clenching under the table. Shelby's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. For so long he had operated under the belief that he was untouchable, that his position would protect him from consequences. But now, faced with irrefutable evidence and the unwavering resolve of Angela and Marcus, he was beginning to realize that his actions had finally caught up with him. When it was Shelby's turn to speak, his lawyer took the floor, attempting to paint a different narrative. The defense argued that Shelby was a dedicated officer who had simply followed protocol, that he had been acting in the interest of public safety, and that Angela's reaction had been misinterpreted as resistance. They tried to frame her as combative, suggesting that she had failed to cooperate, fully hoping to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those present. But Liana was prepared. She countered each argument with calm, incisive rebuttals, systematically dismantling the defense's narrative. When they suggested that Angela had been uncooperative, Liana presented the video evidence showing Angela's calm compliance and Shelby's unwarranted aggression. When they claimed Shelby's actions were by the book, she highlighted the numerous complaints against him, showing a clear pattern of behavior that contradicted any claims of professionalism or restraint. One by one, Liana called witnesses to the stand, each one painting a picture of a man whose authority had become a weapon, wielded against those he perceived as outsiders or threats. Samuel, the former neighbor Shelby had harassed, gave a particularly powerful testimony, recounting the fear and humiliation he felt that night, the sense of powerlessness as Shelby treated him like a criminal for simply standing outside his own home. The testimony of each witness weighed heavily on Shelby. With every story, his image of a dedicated officer eroded further, replaced by the reality of a man who had long operated without accountability. Angela watched him closely, her expression impassive, though she felt a quiet sense of vindication with each piece of evidence that emerged. For the first time, she saw Shelby squirm, the cracks in his arrogance widening as his past misdeeds were laid bare. As the hearing reached its peak, Marcus was called to the stand. His testimony was calm, eloquent, and filled with a quiet strength. He spoke not only as Angela's husband, but as an advocate for justice, drawing on his own experience as a government official to emphasize the importance of accountability. "I've spent my life fighting for justice," he said, his voice firm. "But justice is hollow without accountability. What happened to my wife should not happen to anyone, and I am here today not only for her but for every person who has been mistreated, disrespected, and dehumanized by those who are supposed to protect us." The room fell silent as his words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of the stakes involved. Shelby's lawyer attempted a weak cross-examination, but Marcus remained poised, his responses clear and unwavering. The defense's attempts to shake him were futile. He was unyielding, and the power of his testimony left an indelible mark on everyone present. Finally, it was Angela's turn. She took the stand, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she recounted the events of that night. Her voice was steady, but there was a raw vulnerability in her words, a quiet strength that spoke to the dignity she had maintained in the face of Shelby's aggression. She described the fear, the humiliation, and the helplessness she felt as Shelby dismissed her identity, her profession, and her humanity. Her testimony was simple, unembellished, yet it carried a profound impact. The room listened in silence, captivated by her story, moved by the courage it took to relive that night. When she finished, the weight of her words lingered, a stark contrast to the defense's attempts to deflect and diminish her experience. For a brief moment, Angela allowed herself to glance in Shelby's direction, and she saw, perhaps for the first time, a flicker of something that resembled regret, or maybe just fear. Fear of the consequences he could no longer escape. The panel deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Angela, Marcus, and Liana waited in tense silence, their hands clasped, their hearts pounding. They had come so far, endured so much, and now everything hinged on the decision of the panel. Finally, the lead official cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. His voice was steady as he read the verdict, his words firm and unambiguous. After careful review of the evidence and testimonies presented, we find that Officer Ryan Shelby's actions constitute misconduct, abuse of authority, and violation of protocol. We recommend his immediate suspension, pending further investigation, and potential criminal charges. A collective breath seemed to escape from the room, a mixture of relief and justice finally served. Marcus felt Angela's grip tighten around his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the victory they had fought so hard to achieve. Shelby sat in stunned silence, his face pale, his arrogance shattered. The man who had once viewed himself as untouchable was now confronted with the reality of his actions, his power stripped away, his reputation in ruins. As they left the hearing room, Angela felt a mixture of exhaustion and triumph, a sense of closure tempered by the understanding that this was only one battle in a larger fight. Marcus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, a silent promise of his continued support. Together they walked out into the fresh air, feeling, for the first time since that fateful night, a sense of peace. Outside, a small crowd of supporters and reporters had gathered, eager for news of the outcome. Liana stepped forward to make a brief statement, her voice filled with the quiet authority that had guided them through the ordeal. "Today, justice was served," she said. "But this is just the beginning. We will continue to fight for accountability, for fairness, and for a world where people like Angela Cross don't have to live in fear of those sworn to protect them." As Liana spoke, Angela looked at Marcus, a smile breaking through her exhaustion. She knew that the road ahead would still be challenging, that change wouldn't come overnight. But in this moment she felt hopeful, empowered by the victory they had achieved together, ready to face whatever came next. With her husband by her side and the strength of her own resilience, Angela knew she had reclaimed her voice, her dignity, and her sense of justice. And no one, not even a man like Ryan Shelby, could take that from her again. Several weeks had passed since the hearing, and life for Angela and Marcus was beginning to settle into a new rhythm. The hearing's outcome had made headlines, and Shelby's suspension and impending criminal charges sent a powerful message to the community. It was a small but significant victory, one that held the promise of real change. Angela felt a renewed sense of purpose in her work and her personal life. The experience, as painful as it had been, had revealed to her just how resilient she was and had strengthened the bond between her and Marcus. They had faced a nightmare together and emerged stronger, not only as a couple but as advocates for something much larger than themselves. One evening, Angela sat at her kitchen table, sifting through a stack of letters she'd received from people in the community. Some were from colleagues, others from strangers, people who had seen her story and felt compelled to reach out. There were letters from women who had experienced similar mistreatment, from young men who admired her courage, and from parents who shared their fears for their children in a world where authority was too often wielded as a weapon. Each letter was a reminder of the far-reaching impact of her story, the lives she had touched simply by standing up for herself. Marcus joined her at the table, picking up one of the letters. He smiled softly, reading a line written by a mother thanking Angela for her bravery, for fighting not only for herself but for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of prejudice. "People need voices like yours," Marcus said, pride evident in his eyes. "You've inspired more people than you know." Angela nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude and responsibility. She'd always known that her role as a doctor was to care for her patients, but now she realized that her influence could extend beyond the hospital walls. She could use her platform to advocate for justice, to push for reform, and to make her voice heard in places that needed change. In the days that followed, Angela and Marcus began to speak publicly about their experience. They met with local leaders and community activists, sharing their story in town halls and forums, using the momentum of their victory to advocate for lasting reforms. Angela became a leading voice in the movement for police accountability, her background in medicine and public service lending her a unique perspective. She understood both the fragility of human life and the importance of compassion, values she felt were missing from the current system. Through these efforts, Angela found herself connecting with others who shared her vision. She met activists who had been working tirelessly for years, families who had lost loved ones to police violence, and young people who were eager to see real change. Together, they formed a coalition, a grassroots organization dedicated to advocating for policy changes, mandatory de-escalation training for officers, and a more transparent complaint process within the police department. The coalition grew quickly, attracting members from all walks of life: educators, healthcare workers, lawyers, and even some reform-minded officers who believed in a fairer system. One day, while attending a community event, Angela noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Officer Thompson, the younger officer who had been present during her encounter with Shelby. He approached her hesitantly, clearly unsure of how she would react, but Angela greeted him with a gentle smile. She could see the guilt in his eyes, the weight he had carried since that night. "Dr. Cross," he began, his voice quiet but sincere. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I should have done more that night. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't stand up. I've regretted it every day since." Angela nodded, sensing the remorse in his words. "Officer Thompson, the fact that you're here means a lot. None of us are perfect. What matters is that we learn from our mistakes and work to make things better." Thompson seemed to relax, relief washing over his face. He thanked her, and before he left, he expressed his interest in joining her coalition, hoping to contribute to a better future. Angela was grateful for his sincerity, recognizing that real change required not only accountability but also the courage to forgive and move forward together. As the coalition's work gained momentum, Angela and Marcus's efforts led to tangible results. The City Council began to implement some of their proposals, including new oversight measures for officer conduct and a community-led review board for complaints. These changes weren't a complete solution, but they were a step in the right direction, a sign that their voices were finally being heard. One evening, as Angela and Marcus sat on their porch watching the sunset, they reflected on how much their lives had changed since that fateful night. The journey had been exhausting, filled with moments of doubt and frustration, but it had also given them a renewed sense of purpose. They had turned their pain into progress, their fear into action, and in doing so, they had found a new mission to fight for a world where dignity, respect, and justice were not privileges, but rights for all. Angela reached for Marcus's hand, a smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing by me, for believing in me. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Marcus looked at her, his gaze warm and filled with admiration. "It's not just you, Angela. This fight belongs to all of us. and as long as we're together, we'll keep pushing for what's right." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded below the horizon, casting a warm glow over their home. Angela knew there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time, she felt ready to face them, knowing that she wasn't alone. She had her husband, her community, and a newfound voice that wouldn't be silenced. In the distance, the sounds of their neighborhood drifted through the evening air, a child laughing, friends chatting, the hum of traffic. It was a simple, ordinary scene, but it reminded Angela of everything they had fought for, everything they had achieved. And in that moment, she felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet but unshakable certainty that their efforts, their resilience, had made a difference. For Angela and Marcus, this was only the beginning. Together, they had taken on a broken system and come out stronger, their bond fortified, their spirits lifted. And though the road to justice was long, they were ready for the journey, step by step, knowing that, in the end, the fight was worth every moment.